Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Orchestra podcast. Today we have a very special guest, a friend and fellow teacher, Austin Schlichting. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, I'm Austin Schlichting. A little history about myself. I earned my undergrad in music composition and performance from Washington State University, and then I went and earned my master's degree in music composition from Ithaca College in New York. And after that, a little side story about myself, as I got accepted to a doctoral program, and I would have studied with composers, if you've heard of them, Chen Yi and Zhou Long and James Moberly at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And at the time, this was back in 2010, I was looking around at my friends that were going to Eastman and to Cornell and getting their doctorates, and they weren't finding any jobs. And so at that point in my career, I decided to hit the brakes and go back and get my teaching certificate. So I actually am a high school teacher, just like your teacher, and I compose music. I'd like to think not on the side, but I compose music for a lot of ensembles, including the Olympia Symphony and my string quartet that I perform with, as well as other ensembles around the United States, most namely the Northwest University Symphonic Band. There was a quartet down in Colorado, the Anasazi string quartet, and like professors from Central Washington University and my alma mater, Washington State University. So that sums up kind of where I'm at with things, I think.
At the very least, we've got your tango on the shelf here in PA.
Nice.
And I think we sight read it and a couple of kids recognized it and they just love it. And I dabble in composing myself, but one of my mentors always said that it was absolutely the hardest to write for an intermediate or a learning ensemble.
Yes, I was going to say, I've actually talked to a few teachers about that, about arranging and for composing for a learning ensemble, because that's something they don't really teach at the collegiate level, unfortunately. And something I have to say personally that made me a little bit different, or makes me a little bit different, is my dad was not a composer. He writes music. He does write music, but he taught elementary and high school orchestra for 40 years, actually. And so a lot of things he instilled in me when I was growing up is to write stuff that players can just sit down and read through, because that's really important. Now, I can write music that's really complicated and it takes multiple rehearsals to get through, but I do have to say that it is nice when you're able to understand the technicality of the instrument and what can be read down easily. And before I forget, we don't have to talk about it now, but I'd love to talk about how I wrote that piece, Tango, because that was a kind of a whirlwind composition. So whenever you're ready for it, let me know.
Well, it's just interesting to me how easy it is to write really difficult music. You're not even thinking about it, and the default is just I'll be 50 measures into a composition, and I'll look back on everything and think, I was starting out trying to write this for 8th graders, and there's no way 8th graders can play this. Then I got to go back and change everything. Sometimes it just all goes in the trash. Other times I'm able to make it work. But how do you keep yourself, and I'm sure it still happens where you've realized that there's something that needs to be, changed or fixed. But how do you build up those parameters where the ensemble you've written for will be able to play it?
Well, I have to say that it's a lot of trial and error, because as you write, you discover like, oh, I guess that 4th finger extension isn't going to be that accessible even from my younger cellists at the high school level, unless that's been trained into them for, I would say, at least 2 years before they get the piece or something. It's funny that you mentioned that, because I don't think I get that 100% of the time. I think sometimes I write things that I think are going to be at a certain level, and then they end up being exceptionally hard, like you just described. Or there's a piece, I can just tell you 2 specific pieces. There was a piece I wrote 2 years ago for my friend Joe Sokolek, who teaches in the same district as me. And he said he wanted a grade 4 piece, which essentially means you got the violins going up past 4th position. You've got the cellos reading tenor clef. You've got the violas doing funky finger patterns. And that's all just kind of on the string side. And I was gonna say, so he asked for a grade 4 piece, and I wrote him a grade 4 piece, and he actually he didn't end up performing that piece, not because he didn't think he could. It was more of a it was a financial thing where he had funds, and then he didn't have the funds to pay me, um, and then it was anyway. So there's a bunch of red tape stuff.
Uh-huh.
But anyway, so he respects me as a composer enough to say I won't perform this until I pay you for it.
Mhm.
And so I have it, and I realize that it's not going to be an easy piece when his 8th graders perform it, nor do I think it's going to fit for an 8th grade orchestra, even a really good 8th grade orchestra. But
Uh-huh.
I'm excited to hear it. And so anyway, so there's that. And that kind of goes off of what you're talking about, where you write it and all of a sudden it turns really complicated. And actually, the nice thing is that I've actually just recently recycled that piece for string quartet.
Great.
And I'm putting together, I had a commission to write a 3-movement string quartet. So actually, I pulled out a piece that I wrote recently. I finished it in November for 3 cellos, and I rewrote that for string quartet. And this other one that I wrote for 8th graders, that's I rewrote that for string quartet as well. And actually, right now I'm writing the middle movement. So I'd be happy maybe to send that along to you guys if you're interested. But
Yeah.
my string quartet will be premiering that as soon as the quarantine's over. So that was my first story about that. And the second story is I remember one of the first times I wrote a piece that I thought was going to be a grade 2, which if you talk about grade 2, it's going, okay, the violins are going to have to deal with high 2 and low 2 and whatnot. And the reason why I mentioned the finger extension is I had a lot of C sharps on the G string for all the players.
Mhm.
And I've done that before with my freshman group. And I would say, I don't know, like 80%, 85% of the rehearsal is just tuning those chords where the students are putting their fingers there. And so
Yeah.
I've learned from that. And there's other pieces I've written after that. I still think it's a grade 2. It's just getting the students used to that. But
Yeah.
back to your original question of how do you start it and stop it and everything. I was going to say, if you can do it on your instrument and you can do it very easily, I would say that is a good reminder of, okay, this is going to be an easier
Mhm.
thing. Now I'm saying this, and there might be a few students that I'm talking to that can play, the Bach Partita number 3 and E major all the way through from
Uh-huh.
memory. And you have to kind of put yourself in the mindset of like, okay, did it actually take me one reading to get through this whole piece and
Mhm.
perform it, or was this something that it took me like months to work on? And when you realize, okay, like the time input versus the output, you can kind of gauge areas and how you can put them together. And again, like I said, it's a lot of trial and error. So learn from what you do and how you can make things better. And I mean, that's generally true. A lot of composers, I don't think will admit that, but you get composers that are very impractical with how they write things out,
Mhm.
and they'll learn from that, and they'll go back. I'm trying to think about specifics, like Mozart
Uh-huh.
Symphony number 40. He wrote without clarinets originally because clarinets were such a new instrument when he
Uh-huh.
was composing it. And so there's 2 versions of Symphony number 40, one
Hmm.
without clarinets and one without clarinets. You see this historically with composers. Anyway, I could keep talking about this at length. I mean, but we can
Yeah.
go on to other things if you'd like.
Well, a lot has happened in the world since we set up this meeting, and as of yesterday, the schools are out for the rest of the year. Our first episode of this podcast was with my high school and college composition teacher, Dr. Greg Utz, and something that he brought to mind that's been rattling around in my head is, despite the lack of rehearsals that we're having right now, there are still so many things that we could do so that when we do eventually have another rehearsal, uh, maybe we plan something over the summer or just the first day of school next year. If we do the right kinds of things, we could show up and really surprise all of our peers with how much we've learned and how much we've accomplished.
Right.
One of those things would appear to me, with the availability of so many new tools out there that just weren't available when you or I were in high school. We had Finale Notepad, but it was a hot mess. Uh, how might I begin to compose my own music from a pretty logical perspective where I can see incremental success as a new composer?
So I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant here.
Go ahead.
There's a school of composition, and I'm not entirely sure if there's a name for it, but there's a school of composition that was actually first introduced to me, believe it or not, by the composer John Corigliano. I got to meet him. Yep, I got to meet him. Your teacher can tell you all about him. He's an Academy Award-winning composer, Pulitzer Prize-winning composer, teaches at Juilliard. Fantastic person. I've met him twice in my life, and I'm very thankful for those opportunities to have get to hang out with him. But so he was first introduced to me with him, and when I went off to grad school, my graduate composition teacher, Dana Wilson, who writes a lot of wind ensemble music, he actually taught me this thing. I'm trying to grab a piece of paper here. When you started talking about having exercises for the students, I was looking around for my paper. I've been cleaning, this is my studio right here, and I've been cleaning it up. And I used to have a bunch of reams of paper here, and I don't have reams of paper. So I have a little short piece of paper, which might work a little bit better. So again, I don't know if there's an actual name for this particular school, but this is something I have to say, if I have a commission and I have to write something very quickly, like the tango that you guys read through, I will do this process. So I will just take a sheet of paper and I'll create a graph. And ooh, is this electric? Oh, that's going in the garbage. Okay, so let's say I write a piece of music, and I have my title for this is going to be Port Angeles Orchestra. That's the name of the piece. Good working title, so I remember. And I'll create an XY graph. I'll literally show you what this looks like.
Energy chart kind of thing.
Is that chart kind of a thing? Yep. Yeah. So so what I'll do is I'll go, okay, so what type of piece am I writing? Okay, I'm writing a really crazy piece. Let's think like Hindemith Symphony in B flat major. Let's think the Dies Irae from the Verdi Requiem or something. So and how long do you want this piece to be?
Like 6 to 9 minutes would be great.
6 to 9 minutes. Okay, I'll put down 9 minutes. And that's just so you guys know, that's just from my experience of usually I'll get asked to write a piece and I'll edit it so much that something that's supposed to be 9 minutes will end up being more like 8 minutes or so because I'll edit it so much. And I take a lot of time to edit. I take probably more time editing than I do composing, believe it or not.
Absolutely.
So and that's a skill I didn't learn until grad school, and that's something I reflect on. If I would have been like that with writing papers, I could write a paper pretty well in English, but if I were to actually write it and then like spend every day after that, you know, the week before it was assigned and like go through it and read through it and edit everything, it's such a big process. So okay, so here we go. This is the beginning. The first minute I've got ga 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 ga, like that's my big crazy thing. And then so 50 seconds to a minute of that. And then you know what? We need to have some contrast in there. So I'm gonna put in, I don't know, I'm gonna put a different texture in. And I guess that's why I call this like texture writing. So for the next minute we have, so the first minute's gang, 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 gang. You know, I can play around with some rhythms. I'm thinking Pianistera, string quartet number 2. And we get to, whatever I can do. I can have people sustaining, they keep me moving around. Whatever. Maybe I can add to that and put some counterpoint in there. You know, I don't know, just so anyway, so this is stuff, like I said, stuff that John Corigliano went over with me, and my teacher in grad school went over with me as well. So you can do kind of a color by the numbers kind of a thing.
Oh, I see. Yeah. I assumed the X was energy over time. And I've seen this done with just like a sine wave where it's, high energy and then lower, but not with the shapes and textures. I think that really gives a whole new depth.
Yeah. And and then something you want to do too is form. And you can, if you talk to any composer that got their master's, basically it's a 2-year course in musical form.
Yeah.
So my my master's, my teacher was really big on, okay, you got your A theme, you got your B theme. And I'd say, oh, no, here's my C theme and my D theme. And you go, no, no, no. You got your A theme and your B theme. Okay, now let's expand them and let's contract them and let's play with them and, you know, and all that stuff, all that fun stuff. So if you listen to a lot of my music, I notice myself, and this is just my observation of myself, I tend to lean towards like rondo form because I like to come up with different themes. So,
well,
for
and
instance,
audiences respond to that kind of repetition.
right, exactly, and it's nice to have something familiar, kind of we come back and come back, and like I said, that's one of the reasons why I get so hung up on editing. Something my composition teacher used to have me do in grad school is we'd actually sit down and count out the measures and go, okay, your A melody is exactly 8 measures long. And then I'd come out with my B melody and it'd be 12 measures long or something like that, which doesn't really make sense with phrasing. And so he'd say, well, no, you have to make this so it's either equal to or less than. And by the way, I have to mention, so Dana Wilson, my teacher, he studied with the composer Samuel Adler. Samuel Adler is a really big composer. He teaches at Juilliard as well. He wrote, here, I got it up here on my shelf. He wrote this famous book. And inevitably, whenever I talk to students, I talk to them about this book. This is The Study of Orchestration. Is it coming up as a mirror image for you guys, or is it?
I can read it just fine.
Okay, it looks like a mirror image for me. So this is The Study of Orchestration. And there's a new edition of this book. So by my teacher's composer in there, Samuel Adler. And Samuel Adler studied with this composer named Nadia Boulanger, and she was this famous French teacher who taught the composers like Aaron Copland and Gershwin. I want to say she taught composers like, so that's like earlier 20th century American music, like up through like she taught Philip Glass and Piazzolla.
Well, and just from a historical standpoint, she is how we transition from the really kind of gritty atonal stuff to still modern, still somewhat, 20th century, but we get these new harmonies out of people like Copland and Gershwin, and for the first time when you see a teacher to student, it doesn't sound the same anymore because she had this unique ability to encourage people's strengths.
Correct. Yes.
The students watching.
Yes, and I have to say that that's actually a good strength of a good teacher. There's famous stories about her when she met Piazzolla. Have you heard the story before when she met Piazzolla?
I love it. Please tell it.
Okay, so I'll kind of paraphrase it, and so Piazzolla, who's is he from Argentina?
He's Argentinian, yes.
Argentinian.
The Bandonian.
Okay, and he's this famous back down in South America. He was a famous bandoneon player and composer, and he wrote in these saloons. He wrote this like really romantic like tangos and dance music and really passionate music that you'll hear. And he went to France to study with Nadia Boulanger, and along with all of his music that he had that was his like trunk music that he'd play for gigs and whatnot, he also had his serious music that was sort of sounded like Stravinsky. I've actually never heard it before, but I'm assuming what I've been told is it kind of sounds like Stravinsky. Okay. And so he brought out this music to her. He brought all of his serious music to her, and she said, "I don't like this. Can you show me another score?" And he pulled out another score. And she said, this doesn't seem like you. And he pulled out another one and another one, and finally she said, "Well, do you have anything else to show me?" And he pulled out his like basically his pop music. And she said, that's your music, that's your sound, that's what you should be writing. And so it just kind of goes to show if you're trying to be somebody else, you're not gonna be as successful if you go for who you are and what you're interested in. So that's kind of a paraphrase of that. And I feel like she did that with a few other composers as well. So anyway, a really famous teacher. So back to me and talking about Nadia Boulanger and her whole connection with what I'm doing is she's really, if you ever watch, they actually have films of her teaching, and she's really interested in those types of things about making sure, hey, like you have this much space here and you have this much space and you have this kind of architecture built into your piece of music so it stands. because if and we've all experienced this before, and there's nothing wrong with it, like literally, but I'll hear a piece of music, and I've even heard pieces of music that aren't new. They're like older pieces of music, and I'm kind of like, man, it's not really a great piece of music. Like that's, I don't know. I'm sure your teacher has had that experience too, where you're like, Beethoven. Okay, so case in point, and you can say what you like about it. There's a piece by Beethoven called, there's a piece of music by Beethoven called Wellington's Victory. Have you ever heard this piece before?
No, but I imagine there's a reason why I've never heard it before.
It's a really, really bad piece of music, and I mean, like it sounds normal. Like, you know, if you listen to it now, you might be like, okay, cool. It's just this really quaint piece of music that Beethoven wrote, and you're just sort of like, Beethoven wrote that? Like, okay. So anyway, and if you sit down and you start looking at it, you realize, oh, it's because he spends this much time sitting on the snare drum, and he spends this much time with this march and this march theme, and there's nothing really like to attach yourself to. Not that YouTube didn't exist when I was in school, but it was like a new thing. I remember it coming out, but you could still kind of like find things. I'm sure if you looked on YouTube right now, you could find Wellington's Victory. But I remember pulling it. I found it on vinyl when I heard about it. I found it on vinyl and listened to it, and it's just, yeah, it was kind of a, yeah, right. It's a moldy piece of music. Nobody plays it.
Yeah. Well, it interesting as we have this discussion about how much time a composer might spend on editing and the importance of form, is that and the whole story about Nadia Boulanger and Piazzolla is that what a composition teacher has to teach you isn't, you know, what music is supposed to sound like, but rather how music is supposed to be structured. Because probably if you're coming to a composition teacher, you've got at least an idea in your head of the kind of music that you like or that you enjoy or that you want to bring into existence. And that teacher is there to help you manifest what's in your head.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do have to say that I feel like, and this is true with, I realize also with private teachers or just teachers in general, is I think that teachers in general will focus on areas that they may have had a lot of aha moments or a lot of learning from. And that's something I also have to take in consideration too when I'm kind of going like, well, why did my teacher, because it wasn't something that was like a one time in a lesson, a composition lesson. It was, you know, over multiple days, over multiple semesters. Why did they, you know, want this to happen, or why were they asking me to do this? About a good teacher doing that, where you don't sound like I've had composition teachers call it cookie cutter, where people go to a school and everybody that comes out of the school is kind of cookie cutter, you know, kind of come out sounding the same. I was going to say that I think a good teacher knows like, okay, so like this is the sound here, and this is how they can go from here to there. This is how they can adjust what they're doing. I was going to say the composition students I've had, like the really good composition students I've had, it's always a struggle. And I'd say that too with private, you know, violin, viola students too. It's always a struggle, but it's the students that like match up to that, what the teacher's asking. And I don't think necessarily, I think about what my teachers have asked me to do. I don't think anything they asked me to do would be like completely crazy or completely bizarre, but if I like stepped up to it and like the next week I like focused on that one item, usually things were learned pretty well or substantially for me to continue on. I mean, I also have to say that I have had composition comments before that I would have to say I don't necessarily agree with or want to tell other people. I could start spouting off some of them, but I think that they're just not good to.
There's always the paradoxical relationship between you and the other students of that teacher, is that they're, as a composition student, telling you, well, you really need to be more in a box and you need to put your ideas in better form, more structured. And they're telling everybody else in the studio to go wild and crazy and experiment with new time signatures. And so you feel like you may not be getting the same thing, but that could also be a sign of a teacher that knows what the weaknesses and strengths are of each student. Because that was a problem for me, is I could come up with, you know, 8 really cool themes or melodies or motifs, but I had no ability to stretch them together or develop them in an interesting way. Other people who are maybe better at the counterpoint aspect aren't challenging themselves to break out of the cookie cutter mold.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do have to say something I've been noticing recently, at least the last 3 years,
Mm-hmm.
is I'll usually come up with some ideas and I'm like, oh, that'd be cool on a piece. And I compose on the music software Sibelius. There's two main ones right now. There's Sibelius and Finale. And there's been a few, just admittedly, there's been a few changes to the program to Sibelius that not that I'm going to switch over to Finale, but I do have to say that there's a little, if you talk to Sibelius users, we're kind of in this weird boat right now because it got bought out. Anyway, so I have my Sibelius copy that I compose on every day. I will literally teach it, or sorry, I'll literally treat it like, okay, I only have a half hour to practice, so I'll practice for a half hour, or I only have a half hour to compose, so I'll sit down and I'll compose for a half hour. Thankfully, I mean, one thing I have to say is with this quarantine, I've actually finished up like 2 projects in the past 3 weeks. So, I mean, because it's like I have all this time that's not spent physically being in a classroom and working with 30 plus students at a time. So what I was going to say though is the last 3 years, I'll usually have a melody in my head or some melodies, and I'll spend, I feel like a big chunk of time, like a few weeks, just trying to get the melody or the first minute of the piece of music just like exactly how I want it. And it's almost like the best way I can describe it is it's like cooking something where you might add some spices and it's not the right spice, so you add a little bit more of the main ingredient, and you stir it up, and it needs a little bit more salt, so you add a little bit more salt, but then you add maybe a little bit too much salt, so you have to water it down a little. I mean, like that kind of process, which is like a very quick, like could be like up to as quick as like 5 minutes process for cooking. But maybe a longer term one would be like building a model airplane, and that's something I've never been able to do, because when I build a model airplane when I was younger, I'd take it and I'd try to put it all together at the same time. Chip Schooler uses this analogy with teaching as well, but Chip Schooler is a teacher out in my area, but you look at people that do model airplanes like seriously, and they'll take all the pieces out one day and set them all out for themselves and leave the project and come back, and the next day they'll pick up the pieces and sand off the edges and make sure that all the things are gone, and then set them back down, spend maybe like an hour doing that, and then come back the next day and spend an hour like painting every single spot, every piece, and letting it dry for a day, and coming back the next day and finally gluing together like the inside of the cockpit or something. Same kind of thing where I feel like if I have an idea, and this is going back to your comment about like having an idea for a piece and you're not able to develop on it. If you spend enough time with that idea, that initial idea, like 2 weeks, just getting it, sculpting it so it's exactly what it needs to be, then usually I feel like everything else comes out really smoothly after that. It kind of writes itself. Not all the time, but a lot of the time I feel like you've got that, and you've spent enough time with it that you've created all these different variations, and you've created all these different versions of it in those 2 weeks. And it could be adding that beat there, or subtracting that beat, or adding a little ornamentation, or taking away the ornamentation, or creating a different
I love
harmony.
your model airplane analogy of, if you've got all the cards on the table, all the pieces of the model out, every time you walk away from the table, you're putting those pieces together in your head. And I'm sure that the same way with composition, if you've made that really good opening minute and you leave it for the day to come back tomorrow and I'm assuming to some degree you're scheduling out this much time and that I will be applying that to composition the same way we would with practice. Is that a fair assumption? Every time you leave that, you're thinking about how those pieces fit together for the next time you sit down.
Yes.
And so rather than, throwing more paint on the canvas and making a mess of things, you sort of worked out what needs to happen next in your head.
Right. And I mean, like, there's setbacks, like, you get a phone call, or I love listening to people, like artists, talk about their craft. Stephen King, if you ever listen to Stephen King talk
Mhm.
about writing, he'll talk about kind of similar things where he writes his quota for the days. He writes like 6 pages. Like, so he'll write, and he's like one of the most prolific writers, living writers, but he sits down and he writes 6 pages a day. And so sit down, write 6 pages, and then, go off and do other things. And I guess the thing about that is, 6 pages is, it's a lot of stuff kind of churning out. And he's also, I just think, like a very natural kind of thought process, how things kind of evolve for him. But what I was going to say is, there's other, he talks about how, it's like, well, it's 6 pages a day, give or take, because, there'll be days where, oh, that's right, I have that doctor's appointment, or, oh, it's funny to think about these artists. We set like really high standards that they have lives. Like, he talks about, like, oh yeah, my wife will call and she'll be out of town, so I'll have to talk to her, and that cuts into the time. And something again recently that's I've been thinking about stewing over after hearing Stephen King talk about that is how, like, life happens, and you don't be like, well, I just lost my 30 minutes to write this or whatever. You can talk about what we were just talking about, which is you've got you're thinking about, you're processing things in your head when you're away from it, and
Mhm.
you're coming back to it. You're coming back to it with kind of fresh ears and fresh ideas and whatnot. There's definitely times throughout the composition process where I feel like I spend like the last 10 minutes or like the last hour, and I'm just trying to get that measure to sound exactly how I need it to sound, and I'm trying to different voices and I kind of get it to a point where I'm like, okay, it's okay, whatever, I'll come back to it tomorrow. And I'll come back and I'm listening to it, and I'm like, why was I making a big deal about that? That's great. And like, I move forward.
Mhm.
And likewise, there'll be times where I'll sit down and um, it's usually after. This is another Stephen King thing. Like, he'll write a book, and then he'll leave it, and he'll go off and kind of maybe start a new project or whatever. And then like 2 months later, he'll come back and sit down and read it, and comes to him like
Mhm.
through new eyes, listening to it a different way or hearing it a different way in his head. Um, I'd have to say the same thing is true with writing a piece. If I have enough time to do that, where I can write something and say, okay, like, this is it, and then I can leave it and go on to something else for a little bit and come back to it. Usually, most times I'm pretty happy. Sometimes I'll go, oh, that's why that part never fit together, and I'll do some major revision. Usually it's more or less taking out sections, but that time, like that incubation time, I think is important. You can call it incubation time. Anyway, there's another video of the author Roald Dahl, and he talks
Yeah.
about his process, and it's just him talking about how he goes into this special place. He would go to this special place, like basically this woodshed in
Mhm.
his old house, and it was just remote enough from where he lived that he could kind of feel like he was getting out of his own house. And then he'd sit down in this like recliner and put a blanket over himself and just sit and like um reread what he'd written the weeks
Mhm.
before, and like edit it as you go, and then kind of write some new things, and spend maybe like 3 hours doing that. And then he would,
Mhm.
after 3 hours, he'd close up and go back and do his regular routine for the day.
Mhm.
um so anyway, just things like that. I'm really fascinated about how other artists work and
Yeah.
how they get things
The
done.
process is so intriguing to me, because ultimately the 10,000 hours to mastery, a common thought, if not phrase, that if it's just a matter of putting in that much time, if you practice anything in life the way you would practice an instrument, of setting aside a time and a space where you're going to achieve that task, whether or not you feel like you get anything done in a particular session, you've put in the time, which is maybe having the requisite struggle that day that you didn't think you got anything done, so that you can move past it in the next couple of hours. And maybe you've got a whole week where you feel like nothing done, but you still sat down, you put forth that work, and you've chipped away at the sculpture
Hmm.
to reveal what's in there ultimately.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's funny you mentioned that, because I think, when I practice, um, it's funny because when you get to a certain level where you're not taking lessons anymore, and I feel like a lot of people that I know that went to school and studied performance,
Mm-hmm.
the second they don't have a teacher, they have this weird
Yeah.
it's like a 2-year decline where they don't practice and they don't like pull out their instrument unless like they have a gig. And the sad truth is that in the professional world, your teacher can talk to you about this, and unless you're like actively going out and actively looking for gigs, you're not going to find gigs. And so there's people I know that like, I thought they're amazing flute players or amazing trombone players or amazing violinists, and they don't play anymore, and they're doing something completely different now. So the way I and I think this had something to do with my teacher when I was in high school, but my teacher when I was in my not composition, I didn't take composition in high school. My violin teacher in high school, he would have like this whole, like, you're going to practice Stradic, which is this dexterity stuff. You're going to practice Stradic. You're going to practice, do your scales. You're going to practice your etude. You're going to practice your repertoire. And so kind of coming out and having that kind of 2-year transition period after school of being like, what should I be doing? I just pulled those books out again, and I make a point of, I literally have a notebook that I have. I'm like, okay, I'm going to practice Stradic page 6, 1 through 5, like this week, and I'll practice each of the things, and then I'll go and practice my scales. I'll assign a different scale to myself. If I'm being smart, I'll assign a scale that's in the same key as whatever piece I'm working on for the symphony or whatever. And I'll usually pull out something else that's has nothing to do with whatever symphony I'm working on, or something. I'll pull out an etude or a kind of a piece for myself, essentially. Like that's the best way to describe it. And spend time doing that every day. And I literally will do this. I'll like have a notebook, and I'll sit down weekly, and I'll go, okay, it's Thursday night. I sit down Thursday night. Did I meet all these things? Yes, no. And if I don't, and I know that, I'll review it the next week, and I'll continue on. And anyway, it's just kind of a weird way for me to keep track of things. But like you were saying, it's interesting because I have to say that the days where I just kind of play and I don't, I'm doing everything, but I don't really feel like I'm progressing. Usually those are days much better spent than avoiding the instrument, or days spent where I'm trying to maybe like go off of that path that I have, and I'm trying to maybe cram some. I need to learn this thing. I didn't save enough time this week to work on that scherzo, and I'm just trying to work on the scherzo, which is still good work, but it's not as good, I have to say, as doing the regimen. And same thing with composition. I have to say the days where I set up, and I guess one of the reasons why I don't really talk about doing something for like composing for 3 hours is because, man, when I sit down after about an hour, I get kind of stir crazy. And so I have to take like a 10-minute break, and I'll get up and I'll go out for a walk with my dog, or I'll get up and I'll do something. I'll watch a YouTube video, or I'll do something different for like 10 minutes, and I'll come back and sit down. Like 3 hours straight for me, composition is really, to this day, like kind of taxing for me. I have to take a breath and get up and do the dishes or something like that. And
Hindemith, I think it was Hindemith, that in one of his books referred to these composers who edit and edit and edit and spend so much time with their music that they're never satisfied with it. He used this really obscure German word. It's called Verschlimmbessern, and it's the act of making something worse by trying to make it better. And I forget what the specific reference was, but it was to avoid the Verschlimmbessern at any cost whatsoever. When you realize that you're trying to make it better, and you're spending so much time with that you're not progressing further, that's your cue to stop.
Is it in this one?
Yes.
I don't even remember if there's an index in here. I don't remember that. I remember reading this in graduate school. For those of you who are interested, if you're really into Hindemith, this is a really interesting book. But he just kind of talks about how he does things. But yeah, that sounds pretty accurate. You're never going to reach perfection, and so you're sitting around on that same thing forever.
Well, making something good worse.
Right. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think there comes a time, because I could say, like, when I was younger and I was writing music, I would I get very self-conscious about it. And I
Yeah.
remember doing things like I think when I was in elementary school, I wrote a piece of music for the piano, and my music teacher at the elementary school said, "Oh, you should submit this for this, competition, this basically was some NAFME competition."
Okay.
And and I was like, "Okay, cool." And so I, wrote it out on Finale. My dad had a copy of Finale, who's a music teacher, and submitted it. And then it was like the day of, and my teacher was like, I think because maybe she was reminding me, like, "Hey, like, we're gonna send this off today." I got like really scared all of a sudden. It was like, "Oh, no, 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 no! I don't want to. No, like, don't, let's not do it. I'm too embarrassed." No, and I don't think she submitted it. I think, I don't know. If I had been myself as a teacher, I probably would have just submitted it anyway and just said,
Yeah. Roll with
like, because I think I
it.
was just like really self-conscious about it. A 9 year
Yeah.
old kid wrote a piano piece. And it's funny because much later, like when I was a junior in college, and I could still remember how the piece goes on the piano. It's just a simple 2 voice
Yeah.
piece, like basically like what you call like a 5 finger piece, where your hand kind of sits in one position on the keyboard.
Yeah. Mhm.
Um, and it's funny because I was using the octatonic scale and the whole tone scale, and like
Nice.
and like it made sense to me. And it's like, man, like, if I would have seen that piece like written by an elementary school kid, I would have been like, yeah, like that's right. You're really into this basically dissonant sound. Like,
Uh-huh.
you're really into this thing. Anyway, so yeah, nothing ever came of that. I'm assuming because I said no. But I think as I got older, and um, I'm always admittedly self-conscious of anything I do, anything I write, but I've also kind of learned to be really happy with what I write, and kind of realize, like, hey, that's just where I am in my life, or that's what's going on. And I not necessarily making excuses, but like, I spent I spent 2 hours trying to
Mhm.
work out like that transition there. And it makes sense to me, or yeah,
Well, what you were saying about reviewing your list of what I did or didn't accomplish in that
right,
practice session,
right.
it's not an indicator of success or failure. It's just what do you need to do for
Right.
tomorrow or next week.
Right, exactly. You know, and like, I mean, like you're saying, like when I'm writing, there was a composition teacher I studied with one summer at a music retreat, and something he said to us, which I thought was really important, was, you know, it's kind of good to stop um, before like not to like it's good to just kind of stop when you're ready for that next step,
Hmm.
because then, like you're saying with the analogy with the when I was talking about the airplane model
Yeah.
airplanes, but if you're in your head you're going over what the next thing's gonna you're
Hmm.
gonna work on, you're gonna be good about that. um I think this is a good point for me to talk about the tango and how I wrote that tango.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So the arrangement you have is the string orchestra version, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so I originally wrote that for symphony orchestra.
Hmm.
And what happened was, I there's a conductor and teacher in Eastern Washington. His name's Bruce Walker. Great guy,
One of
awesome
my
guy, awesome
favorite
fellow.
people.
He's one of my favorite people to hang out with because he's so positive and optimistic about everything.
Hmm.
But I was getting my teaching certificate, and he knew I wrote music, and he called me up. He conducts the Yakima Youth
Hmm.
Symphony, and he said, "Austin, I'd love for you to write a piece of music that's 3 to 5 minutes." He was very specific. You don't always get this. I was very thankful. He wants to be 3 to 5 minutes in length. Has traditional, like, classical scoring. So basically, two flutes, two oboes,
Hmm.
two clarinets, two bassoons, uh, two. I think there's three trumpets in there. Three, like, it's really important to know the scoring. Three
Yeah.
trumpets, uh, four horns, or maybe I think that one's two horns, two trombones, and percussion, three percussion, and timpani and strings. Something along those lines, which is pretty standard.
Mhm.
And and so he called me up, like, I want to say a week before Thanksgiving break, and I said, "Oh yeah, no, like, I'd love to do that." Um, and I was looking at my schedule, and I had all these. When you're getting your teaching certificate, you have all these practicums, and you have all these
Mhm.
things like papers you're writing on top of observing students and whatnot. And I realized, I said, the only time I'm really going to have to write this where I'm not going to have anything going on is during Thanksgiving break. And so what happened was I did this with the piece. I did what I was talking about. I kind of sculpted out what I wanted to do, and did my school the week before break, and then I worked it out with Western Washington University, which is where I got my teaching certificate. I worked it out so that they were going to do a orchestra reading session when we came back from break. And so like the composition department was really excited about that, and the orchestration class was really excited about that. And then I was able to weasel in not just that piece, but another one. But I wrote that piece basically in a week. And what I did was, I think I spent about 2 days doing what I was describing, where I feel like I spent a long time, like 2 weeks, just like working out that first minute and getting that first minute sounding exactly right. I can tell you right now, there's a part in that piece towards the beginning where it gets to the end of the phrase, bum ba da ba da, bum bum ba 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 dum ba dum ba da ba ba bum ba 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 bum. That particular measure, ba 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 bum. I was very close to taking that measure out. I wanted to go immediately into it, but I figured, you know what, this is at the beginning of it, and I can kind of like, I have these conversations with my old teachers in my head, and going, like, oh well, I could streamline it and take that out, but it's at the beginning of the piece, and it's just like this little cutesy thing. And what sold me on that was actually I had it all on MIDI, and I was kind of showing it around to some friends, and people would kind of, oh, that's kind of fun when you do that. So I mean, that was sort of my validation of, okay, like I'm not on the wrong track with this, putting that little measure of funness in there. But yeah, so I spent about 2 days, which would have been normally like 2 weeks for me, kind of planning out that first minute, and then I wrote it out, and this kind of design of doing it, it was like filling in the color by the numbers or something like that. Yeah. So I have the bum ba bum 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 bum. Little, I feel like admittedly I was nodding towards
Carmen.
Rhapsody on a Theme by Paganini.
Oh yeah, I hear it.
And then there's a little of that song Besame Mucho on there. I think what I do though is I make it my own. I don't verbatim do that. And speaking of doing that kind of thing, I have written pieces of music, and I studied a lot of Charles Ives when I was in my master's, and so I do a lot of I like to do borrowing of music every once in a while, and I'm very forthright with saying, by the way, this is what I'm doing. And it's not just Charles Ives, like Schumann would do that with Bach, and
Bach transcribed so many of the Vivaldi keyboard suites and just called them his own.
Right, exactly.
It was Vivaldi keyboard suite by Bach.
Right. No, totally. Or like, I think a fun game is listening to Buxtehude and Bach side by side, because you're like,
who's borrowing from who at this point?
Right.
What they were doing is not just appreciating each other's work, but also trying to understand how that music operated. Because when the reason that Bach, for example, with the Vivaldi keyboard stuff, he was just trying to understand in completeness the counterpoint that Vivaldi was doing and the harmonic relationships. And a good way to do that is to just write them out.
Right.
I paid the cash to attend the web-based seminar that Philip Glass was doing.
Like a Facebook thing or whatever. Like inside the things.
And pretty much his only advice was, if you want to be better at orchestration, take a score from your favorite composer, a piece that you really enjoy, and just write it down on paper. Because then you'll understand how each instrument works with each other. And if it's the way that you're trying to emulate in your own writing, that's really the best way for you to come to an understanding about how that orchestration works.
And I think that there's something to that where I can hear one of my old composition teachers saying, well, don't do that because then you're not discovering it on your own. Whereas I think from experience I can say, um, I don't I think you absorb it into what you do and what is natural to you.
Yeah.
And Philip Glass, I think he probably talked about this, but he spent years transcribing Ravi Shankar. Like
Yeah.
that was the person. And if you listen to Ravi Shankar's music, it's one line of music. It's not a lot of counterpoint, at least counterpoint in the European sense, at least to
You can
my
see
knowledge.
the lineage if you really know Philip Glass's work, but you don't think, gee, Akhenaten sounds a lot like Ravi Shankar.
Right, right. And so I mean, like there is that practicing those things and getting that together. I don't think it necessarily hinders your artistic being. Um, I think something also to add to everything. I was making a mental note of this beforehand, but if you, I have to say, to my some a piece of a little tidbit or a little nugget of wisdom. I have to say, if you are interested in composition, but you are also you're struggling as coming up with ideas or coming up with
Uh-huh.
like a project or something, arranging, if you can arrange, like
Yeah.
that is a great outlet, because if you're arranging, you're you're really doing what we're talking about, where you're really internalizing a piece of music and
Mhm.
you're making it new, and you're creating a new version of it. And I don't think of arranging as being like um, secondary to composition. In fact, the more I do it, the more I kind of realize arranging actually, there's some arrangements of pieces that I actually like the arrangement better than the original
Yeah.
version. And um, I was gonna say, you learn a lot through that process of
Yeah.
arranging. More recently, I've been asked to orchestrate. I'm working on
Mhm.
one of the projects I'm working on right now is I'm working on an orchestration of this piece uh, that is for two pianos.
Mhm.
And this lady in Tacoma wants to play it. It's a concerto, but she wants to play it with a symphony, and there's no um, orchestration. There's
Mhm.
no like full symphonic version by the composer. It's just a two piano concerto. And so I've sat down and like basically I kind of did the orchestration version of this,
Yeah.
where I sat down with a score, and I've written in, okay, like this is where this is where the winds come in, and this is where this I want to have the strings drop out and
Mhm.
have brass and woodwinds, and this is where I want to have lots of percussion. And I've written it out kind of in that space, and it's kind of fun because, like I said, it's like color by the number. But as I'm working on it, and I get up every morning and I read for about a half hour, and then I pull out my
Mhm.
Sibelius and I compose for about an hour and a half. But um, I was gonna say, it's fun because of all that pre-planning I did. It
Mhm.
just feels good as I'm writing it out. And I have to say right now with this particular project, I'm not having to sit and rethink about, oh well, that goes out of that range or whatnot, because I'm
Mhm.
hearing the orchestration in my head as I'm going through it. And I'm going through the piece kind of not knowing a lot about it, and really appreciating new things about it.
Mhm.
And the reason why I'm talking about orchestration again is uh, I actually wrote another orchestration, believe it or not, right before this. That was one of the projects I finished up during like the first 2 weeks of the
Mhm.
quarantine. Was I was asked to reorchestrate Bolero, believe it or
Mhm.
not. Bolero being one of the most famous orchestrations. Like,
Yeah. You would
so,
think that needs to be said a different way, but
right,
okay.
right. Well, the reason why, and it like I wouldn't have done it unless it made practical sense.
Yeah.
But there's a ballet company, a local ballet company, that wants to do it, and they want to
Okay.
have a live orchestra.
Mhm.
And it's funny because they know that if they have a live orchestra, uh, they're going to feel better having like a live
Mhm.
group doing it. They're the audience is going to enjoy having a live orchestra better. It's like if you ever play with a ballet or an opera,
Mhm.
like everyone's kind of equally there for the orchestra as well as the people on the stage.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
and I don't know if that was necessarily intentional when both of those were developed, but it's kind of a nice feeling to be in the pit
Mhm.
because you're really a part of the show. Anyway, but we can't fit the full Bolero orchestra into the pit.
Okay, now it's making sense to me. So it's you just couldn't fit all of the parts that are in the original in the pit.
Right. And it's a large
Oh yeah.
orchestration. And he wrote it, Rebel, like that's another thing too, is I, did a little bit of research and whatnot. In fact, actually, I'll put in not necessarily practical jokes into my music, but I'll put in like little things every once in a while just to acknowledge things.
Yeah.
So one of my little practical jokes I put in is the snare drum part for Bolero is the same thing in the original version. It's like
For all
15
10
minutes.
minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
For
the
however
same cadence for 15 minutes practically. The last 2
it's got
measures
a
are
roll at the
different.
end. Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's a little different. There's an ending for the snare part for the snare drum. So when I was editing it and putting it all together, I like to make the parts look really clean. That's another note I have to say is if you want people to take your music seriously, make really really
Gotta
clean
look
parts.
nice. Yeah.
And if you don't make really clean parts, then people will be upset. Basically,
Well,
people will.
and even highly paid composers that educators like us buy on J. David Pepper, they don't always think about page turns. It's like the most obvious thing that has to happen while you're playing a piece of music, and there's no place to turn the page.
Mhm.
Well, what happens if you're in a wind ensemble and you're the only one playing your part?
Right, exactly. And I mean like that kind of stuff, like making. I will go to a FedEx and I'll make really nice copies and I'll put it on off-white, like a yellowish paper.
Yeah.
And that's usually when the people get my music. Like the last 2 times the Olympia Symphonies performed my music, they come up to me at the break, or they come up to me after rehearsal and they say, "Man, like you really put a lot of thought into this." And I take that as the person realizing, like, if you put this much thought into how this looks for me, I'm going to put that as much time and effort into learning
Into
my part.
preparing the music that you wrote as well. Yeah.
Right. So back to this Bolero part, I took
Yeah.
the snare drum. This is my little sense of humor. The way that the formatting worked was the first page had like 10 lines of music, and I try to keep it. That's stuff that Samuel Adler talks about in his orchestration book. He has like a whole section at the end about how you should make your parts look. But he says something about, you should only have 10 staffs per page. And so I always try to do that, like 10 staffs. So the funny thing about the snare drum part is it's the same thing over and over again. You have a lot of repeated measures. And the part actually, it comes out to be, I don't remember, I'm saying off the top of my head, but it's like 13 lines. So I have the second page, which has all this blank area. And I was trying to play around with, okay, well, maybe on one page I can have like 6 lines and 7 lines on the other. It looks kind of weird and it's like too much space. So what I ended up doing was I put 10 lines on the first page and 3 lines on the second page. And on the bottom of the second page, I put like a bunch of Bolero trivia down.
Oh, that's funny.
So with the thought that the snare drum will probably just sit there
and read those instead.
Yeah. And like there's a bunch of interesting things I learned about the piece. Did you know that the Bolero, before John Williams wrote the score for Star Wars, Bolero was the temp music for the film? So like, can you imagine like the initial like Star Wars like credit roll with like yeah. And then and there's things though that I can hear now in the music, because there's the stuff in like when Luke Skywalker goes for he shoots at the Death Star where they have dun 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 dun, dun, and that's totally dun 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 dun.
Yeah.
So anyway, like that was really fun. So back to the way Bolero was written. It was written for ballet. It was specifically written for a ballet company, and this is like in the Paris Ballet. And they probably I've never been to Paris before. I'd probably, one of the first things I'd want to do if I ever went to Paris would be to see like a ballet show.
Oh yeah.
I'm assuming they had like a grand house that had a massive pit for the dance or for the orchestra to be. But yeah, the orchestration, it's very heavy. The whole piece is very heavy. Some things I did because I had fewer instruments. Some things I did with the orchestration was I made a point, if an instrument comes in, like for instance, the saxophone comes in. I have the saxophone just keep playing because it's like, well, I'm missing these other parts, but I might as well have the saxophone keep playing.
Well, why
So
would you bring him in just for 4 measures anyway? If you're going to pay
like,
somebody to come out, and
right,
play the saxophone
right,
part, give them
right,
something to do.
right, exactly. And so, I mean, like, and it's something that, that way, I know I've performed it once in my lifetime. I played second violin on it, and believe it or not, the second violin has more notes than the first violin
Oh,
part.
absolutely. That's pretty
And
common. Yeah.
and the I think that it's important that, hey, I think in the end I made sure that I there are spots where people rest, but it's like resting for 2 measures before they come in on a big
Mm-hmm.
like melody entrance or something. But I took into account that kind of stuff. Now, is it always smart to do that kind of stuff? Maybe not, but like, um, if you have the instruments there, you might as well use them and add all those colors to a piece. So again, arranging, like, you can
Yeah.
learn so much from arranging a piece. I love, actually, I should email you this. I wrote an arrangement of the Brahms fourth movement from is it the G minor piano quartet? Dun 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 dun
Yeah.
dun.
The
Dun.
one that Schoenberg turned into a symphony.
Yeah, yes, yeah. Schoenberg rewrote it. Yeah, he reorchestrated it too. So I orchestrated that actually, and I studied the Schoenberg score just a little
Yeah.
bit, but I studied enough to, because he puts little nuances in that aren't in the original
Mm-hmm.
Brahms. Like he has like going on every once in a while. I scattered that throughout my arrangement, but I wrote it for string orchestra because I'm like, dude, this is like, in my mind, better than like some of the Hungarian dances. Like, this should be like a standalone
But
thing.
the first time I heard that movement in particular, when they get to the Scottish snaps, for lack of a better term, the ba-dum bum ba-dum 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 ba,
Mm-hmm.
my immediate thought was that's got to be orchestrated for a bigger group. Just as soon as I heard it, as you gain, for the students out there, some compositional expertise or experience, or just ambition, listening to pieces of music, you're going to get that impulse to arrange something, or to talk to one of your composer friends of, hey, has this been arranged or reorchestrated ever?
And
And
I
there's a
also
lot
have
of
to
value.
say,
Sorry, go ahead.
and if it has been, and you really, really want to do it, go do it. I mean,
Yeah, don't stop yourself. There's still more to be said.
my friend Joe Sokolik, the one that I wrote that grade 4 piece for his 8th grade orchestra, he just said on Facebook yesterday something about
The Bach chorales?
the Bach chorales. So
Yeah.
he's gonna write 100 Bach chorales, and if you've ever seen a Bach chorale, I feel like none of them are no more than 30 measures long, or
Mm-hmm.
I might be making up that number. Like they're anywhere from like 8 measures long to 32 measures long or
Mm-hmm.
something. And I don't know. I can't think of a chorale that's actually 32 measures long, but I think that's great. I mean, what a great way to flex your, arranging skills. And I mean, I do have to say also that if you're good at arranging, you'll bring in some nuance to it. Like
Mm-hmm.
you'll figure out a way to put the instruments in a satisfying order. I think a good test after you've done a few arrangements, I would call a transcription, is if you put the first violin part as the soprano and the second
Yeah.
violin part as the alto, and etc., and you go down the score. But a good way to make it from a transcription to an actual arrangement is if you go, well, I'll give the viola part the melody here, or
Mm-hmm.
I'll give the moving line, hey, the alto part actually goes down,
Well, as we're thinking about ways to keep students engaged,
Mhm.
if we were to present them with a composition project, would it be more beneficial to start with a transcription project, or to start with just, hey, come up with what you got? Which would maybe be a more fruitful path for them to walk?
That's a good question. Actually, if you're my experience from my schooling, and also my experience from my just teaching in general, if you're trying to get them used to MuseScore, which I'm sure a lot of them haven't experimented with MuseScore, uh, or I don't. This is such a weird time because there's some students that they're going to take this and they're going to run really fast with it
Mhm.
and do really well, and there's some students that are going to take their time and kind of figure things out.
Hmm.
Um, I was gonna say just notating things. I
Uh-huh.
mean, I would even go so far as taking a. I'm trying to find my. I got it here. Taking the
Oh,
taking the facsimiles, like take a facsimile and be like, okay, rewrite. I don't know.
so just
Right,
literally notating something that already exists.
right, exactly. I bought my nephews a
Uh,
copy of Sibelius for their birthday,
oh, great.
and my thought was, so the way I got good at doing Sibelius was my dad, like I said, was a music teacher, and I thought this was awesome, and maybe you can find a few students to
Hmm.
do this as well. But he had these scores that he had the score, but he was missing the viola part, or
Yeah.
he had all the parts, but he was missing the score, and um, so he was pretty smart with me in that my senior year of high school, I think I had met all of my requirements. I know we have
Mhm.
Core 24 now, but
Yeah.
I had met all my requirements, and so my senior year was fun because I took like an AP literature course,
Hmm.
and I never I I was supposed to sign up for U.S. history my sophomore year, but I wanted to do AP US, and the AP US history at the teacher at the time was goofy and said I had to, like, I couldn't do it unless I did this prerequisite course. And
Oh,
then,
yeah.
like, anyways, it was funky because then, like, he left, and then we got another AP teacher, and he's like, yeah, you should totally sign up. So I was kind of holding off on AP US until my senior year, and it didn't fit in my schedule because it was on top of orchestra
Oh,
or choir or
no.
something like that. So what ended up happening as a senior is I took sophomore U.S. history, and so I was like a senior in this class and just
Yeah.
like hanging out. Like my teacher always was really happy I was there. Like, so anyway, like I kind of I don't know, made things kind of lighthearted or something. So yeah, I was anyway. But I took so my senior year I took drama, I took choir, I took orchestra, and then I had my first period.
Uh,
Um, I couldn't figure out what to do. I was like, well, should I do? I don't know what I should do in here. And my dad said, well, why don't you do an independent study in composition? And I was like, really? I could do that? And he's like, yeah. I'm like, cool. Who'd be my teacher? He's like, oh, I will. And so I got all this free time on
mhm.
we had like one school computer that had Sibelius 2 on it. And so I'd get done doing my 0 period swing choir class, and then I would just play around on the computer and basically taught myself how to do Sibelius from my knowledge of using Finale. And um, after like the first week or two of school, my dad said, "Okay, I've got this score here. I need a viola part," and so I wrote out the viola part and
Mhm.
made sure everything looked good and showed it to him. And he found a few spots that I needed to mark up or change, and didn't
Mhm.
put an accidental in the right spot or something. And so I had to teach myself how to do that. And then like I did those types of projects for the first little while, and they started giving me, okay, here's the first violin part, second violin part, viola, cello. Can you write a score out for me? And so I do that.
Mhm.
And um and so with my nephews, one's in high school, one's in 8th grade, and they're both very musical. But I was gonna try to do maybe something similar with them and send them. I have all these Star Wars pieces for solo violin,
Mhm.
and I was thinking about sending them those. And my older nephew plays viola, so I was gonna say, hey, can you rewrite this violin part? And then what I want you to do is transpose it down a fifth and change the clef to alto clef and make it into
A
a
viola.
viola solo, and then he'd have a viola version of that piece. Um, so I think transcribing, like,
Mhm.
especially like, you might want to have two options: have a transcribing
Yeah.
option, or a straight up arranging option. But um, yeah, transcribing it so it fits in a certain spot. I mean, I've done this before with students too, is like taking the uh I can't remember which composer it is. The DeBarrio, like the 12 easy duets. He has a bunch of violin duets, but he has one that's like, they're like really easy. You know which ones I'm
Mazes?
talking? Which one?
Mazes?
Not Maz's. I want to say DeBarrio.
Could be.
So I could look that one up. I got to write this down. So I got to send you the Brahms arrangement, and I got to send you
Yeah.
the. But I started doing that where I wrote them, and transcribed them basically for viola, because
Mhm.
it's like, hey, this works on a violin. Why don't we do this on a viola as well? I think that'd be a good experience, and it'd
Mhm.
get them used to how to use the software.
So if we are going through kind of a progressive approach to thinking about composition, maybe that surface level would just be, like you suggested, there is a piece that exists already, but just putting it into a notation software. I think
Right.
MuseScore is what's available, and I use it for a lot of my arranging, and it does pretty much everything I need it to do, except for the finer points of actually making a part that Sibelius does really well, where you can anchor certain things in certain places. MuseScore won't do that, but just the notation itself is pretty easy. And
Yeah,
maybe
MuseScore like works pretty smoothly.
yeah, it works really well.
Students create, like, it's usually I'll get a student that comes in and wrote something, and I'm really usually pleased, and I'll have the orchestra read through it, like, and that's kind of sporadic. Do you ever do the CBAPA test with your students, which is like the card commercial jingle?
No, I haven't done that one.
Oh, so it's kind of funny because the way it's written out is, it's like, that's not at all how I'd write a piece of music, firstly. But I think in the parameters it says something about, like, if you can do something like this, like, please attempt to do it, or like, if you have modifications, like, you can modify this as any way you want it to be. So I'll usually give my students that the actual assignment as it's written out, and I'll say, hey, can you like, it has all these things that you're supposed to do, but can you just make sure it's 16 measures long? And usually kids will come up with something. A lot of kids will kind of fill up 16 measures of music,
Mm-hmm.
but you get a few that actually write out something. We did one last year where I liked it enough that I said, "Do you want to perform at the spring concert?" And we did that. So
Okay.
yeah.
So maybe what's the next step past just writing down something that already exists? Would that be the transcribing for a different group of instruments, taking something that does exist, but changing the key or the instrumentation?
I suppose, yeah, that could be the next thing, like rewriting it. So if you want to be able to see what it looks like if you're a
Mm-hmm.
violist and you want to be able to play it on violin, you could rewrite it so it's in treble clef. Or I was gonna say, there was a senior, she's a freshman now in college, but she was asking me, because a bass professor wanted her to rewrite these cello suites,
Mm-hmm.
not Bach cello suites, some other composer did these cello suites, but she wanted her to rearrange them on string bass. So
Mm-hmm.
like, going through the process of actually notating it, and then she'd have to transpose it as well so that it actually made sense.
Yeah.
Bass. But yeah, I mean, like, man, I wish I had better things to just kind of come up with for this. I was gonna say, transcribing it, writing it out, and then if you were to do something like a a Bach two-part invention or something, like,
Mm-hmm.
so you'd write it out for piano, and then, okay, so which two instruments would you choose to do this two-part invention? And through that process, theoretically realizing, like, oh, this doesn't fit. I haven't used MuseScore enough to know, does MuseScore let you know if something's out of the instrument range?
Yeah. It's a little on the safe side. I think it says the above the staff F for violin is impossible. It highlights it as red.
Yeah.
But that for me, that has been most important when arranging for winds or brass, because it is pretty accurate with what's uncomfortable for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny because Sibelius, it will show maroon notes if it's like, and it's very conservative about what is
Yeah,
a full on.
overly
This should be
conservative.
heard. And then the maroon notes are like, oh, well, it'd have to be an expert player. But I'm sure you and I both, when we were in high school taking private lessons, it's like, yeah, no, that maroon note's like nothing. And then it turns red if it's like completely out of the range.
Oh,
I think that's how Sibelius
yeah.
does it.
MuseScore doesn't differentiate between difficult and impossible. It's just as soon as it's out of,
Yeah.
defined parameters, it's just red.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. So I was gonna say something I've learned, if I really want, like back to that question about writing for grade level and stuff like that, something I've learned is if you are trying to get something to be read by students, it's not practical to expect them to be able to read some if it is saying it's out of range,
Mm-hmm.
So like that, if it is enough, 4 letter or
That's knowing your ensemble, like like you're talking about with Bruce, where he really laid out who's playing.
Right. And I mean, like, again, if you're writing it out, so there's this piece of music. So like I say, I arrange and I orchestrate. So there's one of my friends, her name's Marta Keene. She wrote this famous choral piece called Homeward Bound, and it gets sung all the time.
Yeah.
I
concertmaster with this group, Ensign Symphony and Chorus. It's kind of like the Mormon Tabernacle, but the Northwest equivalent, and we do that piece all the time.
Yeah. So that's a big one. So Marta, who's one of my personal friends, she and actually she's been a good mentor for me. I can talk about her in a second, but she gave me all this music that because she's this published composer, she gave me all this music to engrave, to write out on Sibelius, because she was sending him off to Alfred. And one of the pieces is a piece she wrote, and it's just under a minute long. It's like 50 seconds long, but it was for her wind orchestration class at PLU, because she went to Pacific Lutheran University for her master's. And so she gave me the score and the recording. I actually have the score she gave me somewhere around here. Anyway, and like a few years ago, like 6 years ago, I rewrote it, so it's like a 3-minute band piece. Mm-hmm. She always had it in her head to have it be a big like middle school, high school band piece. And I expanded it and did all sorts of fun things. I put it's a piece called Dog Walk. And mm-hmm. So I added percussion in and added parts with like squeak toys and stuff.
Oh, okay.
And she really enjoys it, but I've kind of hit a few snags working on it, because I've written it out for band. I know for a fact it's not accessible by middle school band, and she has it in her heart to have it be middle school band. So actually, as soon as I finish up this piano concerto orchestration, I'm going to sit down and keep revising that. But that's one of those pieces for me that I'm like, I keep coming back to after a few months or a few years, and I keep revising. But what I was going to say about this particular piece is she wrote all these gnarly scale figures in, mm-hmm. where you're using what are called dovetailing, where on the score it goes like, if you have the first violin, you see this in Holberg Suite, first movement. Oh yeah. So that's a compositional technique called, as far as I know, it's called dovetailing, where you start with one voice. Doesn't necessarily have to be the highest voice, but works out really nicely with Holberg Suite. It starts off on one voice, and then the last note they play is the first note that the next person plays.
Yep.
Yeah, and the reason why it's important to say dovetailing is because if you just had to be then you we naturally want to put a space in, but because there's a destination note, then it tells the next person when they're joining the roller coaster ride.
Well, and the term dovetail is from wood joinery, of putting things together mm-hmm. where they perfectly fit. Mm-hmm. And so that term, rather than something that I might, not knowing the term myself, might make up, would be less descriptive of what it's trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. And it's something I do a lot with my wind writing. When I write wind parts, where it's the wind parts going, I'll do that because they have to breathe and everything.
Yeah.
So the way she wrote out these lines is she has all these like whole, like basically whole tone, da 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 da, but they're kind of fast. They're like sextuplets and whatnot. And so I've rewritten that out so it actually kind of it's not the sextuplet. It's just dun 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 dun, that kind of
Oh
stuff
yeah.
going on. And just so it's, I feel like with more people, it's going to be a little bit more accurate and whatnot. And she's, you know, she's told me up front, like, yeah, no, like that's good. Like make it accessible to people.
Mm-hmm.
I notice that when I'm making arrangements or when I'm writing music, the more information I can give, the better. Because I mean, like this morning when I was working on this orchestration, so this piece, it's supposed to be for double winds and brass. So I have two trombones, and the piano, the second piano part goes down to a low D, like the lowest D on the keyboard, and my lowest brass instruments are my trombones, and the trombones can't get that low, but a bass trombone can. And so I wrote in the score, like, hey, if you don't have a bass trombone, just play this one note, one octave above. And likewise in the string bass part, you have string basses that don't have C extensions. I'm assuming this ensemble, they're not going to have C extensions. I just say the same thing, like if you don't have a C extension, play this note, you know, an octave up. And I wrote it out as a small note and everything, so it's really clear. But I have found that performers, amateur performers and professional performers, are really happy when you have as much information as possible. And I'm not saying to put like a bowing on every single note or whatever, but like I'll go through my string parts and bow them all. And usually, because if you have a new piece of music with a concertmaster's never heard it or anything, it gives them some insight. And yes, like and as a composer, I also am really quick to say, you know, if you want to do a different bowing, you have my permission. I just, you know, this is what I was going for. And I've gone through scores that have been performed of mine, and I've gone through the parts, and it's interesting because the concertmaster will make minimal changes, but they usually are like stay pretty close to whatever it is I'm asking for them to do. So back to this commentary about arranging and whatnot, and going from a transcription to actually arranging it out for voices. It's funny because like a two-part Bach invention, you might think, oh well, this I'm thinking of like is it the fourth one? You might think, oh well, you know, on a good day I can play that up in third position, which is doable, but you know, the second you give it to a violist, the violist is going to have to deal with playing it up in fifth position now, you know, or something like that. So you can have fun with it and change up the voicings, or figure out, like problem solve what you're going to do to make it so it's accessible. I've seen people take those types of things and rewrite them out, and they do a really crafty job. They do like a surgical job, it almost seems like, to get everything so it fits with the voices they're using. And I mean, that's definitely what you're doing in orchestration. Every time you write in orchestration, you're trying to figure out, this doesn't fit in the flute range, but I can do like a, you know, do this or do that. So yeah, do you have more questions for me, or are we getting to the time limit? Oh wait, we're only 30 minutes in, aren't we? Boy, we're like an hour and a half in.
Yeah. Oh. That's okay. As we depart from the, let's assume that some students have just notated digitally something that exists, and maybe they took the next step and transcribed something, and maybe they're ready to make something that's new and is all their own. Where, once they get past the energy chart that you've shown for us, how might they begin crafting that perfect minute that you were talking about earlier? What kind of pieces do they need to consider? I mean, quite broadly, understanding that these are probably people who've never attempted composition of any kind before.
I was going to say, be patient with yourself. Like that's my biggest tidbit. You could spend, you know, an hour one day racking your brains, and then the next day it takes you 10 minutes to get through a thing. I would say, if you have to write a piece of music, to not wait till the last minute to do it, to like start working on it, because then you have more time with it and you can figure it out. something I always think about when I'm writing is there's composers like Mozart where, I mean, it makes me appreciate Mozart more and more.
Mhm.
There's people like Mozart where he wrote these pieces and he wrote them really quickly. And
Mhm.
there's a lot of composers that do that, like Benjamin Britten. Like one of my favorite pieces by Benjamin Britten, Young Person's Guide. I think he wrote it like in 2 days or something ridiculous like
Yeah.
that. Which
Well,
is like
the Hindemith music he wrote overnight on the boat ride to Britain. It's just
right,
insane.
right. And like, you know, the overture to Don Giovanni was written the morning of the premiere, and
Mhm.
like the D minor string quartet by Mozart was written while his wife was giving birth to their first child. Like there's just weird things like that you hear about from composers. But something I think you should also take in consideration is they spent a lot of time developing those techniques. And if you haven't done that, don't be comparing yourself to, don't be putting yourself up to next to Mozart. Bach, what's funny about Bach, we were talking about this earlier, but he transcribed a bunch of stuff on his own and put
Yeah.
his name on it. And same thing where he took it's funny because the more Bach you listen to, the more you realize like, oh, dang, that's Brandenburg 3. He just took that from another piece he had written before. Oh, that's the third partita, first movement. He just rewrote that as a overture for a
Mhm.
cantata or something.
Well, and one of Mozart's flute concertos is also one of his clarinet concertos. Is also his oboe concerto.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You know, and I feel like there's some like kind of, I think that we're led to believe there's some like deceptiveness to that. But like there's the composers like Brahms that said, "Oh, I wrote me these two clarinet sonatas, but because they're in the same range as
Those
the
are great viola
violas."
sonatas.
Yeah,
Those
yeah,
are great. I love
yeah,
those.
yeah. So, but I mean, like, you know, you learn how to be crafty with these things, and go, you know, I could, you know, rewrite this. Back to composer John Corigliano.
Mm.
Um, he the second movement of his violin sonata, I'm sure this has been done since, but I saw him in an interview one time with James Galway, and he was talking about how he's like, yeah, the second movement of my violin sonata I think would sound really good on a flute, so I wouldn't be surprised if now that
Mhm.
has been done, because I can hear it. It's like, yeah, that would be a really cool piece on a flute. Anyway, so give yourself time, be patient. It's a frustrating process. You're showing off a part of your self that is not basically something people see on every day.
Mhm.
So be be ready to make mistakes. Be ready to experience things. I was thinking about how um, um, you know, the best thing you can do is just get something out,
Yeah.
and and aim to make something of quality. Don't just fill up a minute of sound.
Yeah.
You know, people, I don't know, people tend to complain about people like John Cage, about like, oh well, he's just, you know, making sound for sound's sake. But I think John Cage, if you really get
You look
into,
at his scores. He was spending a lot of time making it exactly the way he wanted.
right, I'm just gonna keep pulling up books that I have here. I have a whole book of notations, John Cage.
Oh yeah.
So he has, is actually the best thing is that I think he only references himself like once or twice in here,
Oh,
but it's
really?
this big thick book of notations from other composers. So like just they're like pieces of artwork almost, like.
Mm-hmm.
So he just collected this volume of these things, but it's interesting to look through. I'll pull this out every once in a while when I have a student that says like, oh, I don't know. Something I have to say is sitting down and writing with my instrument out or at a piano or something like that. There's something freeing about that in comparison to writing something out directly onto MuseScore.
Yeah.
Because if you're writing something out in MuseScore, it's like a 3-step process to get the note on the page versus sitting down and using this thing to write out. One summer in grad school, between my first year and second year in grad school, my
Mm-hmm.
computer broke, and so I was getting it repaired and everything. And my one of not my composition teacher, but one of the composers at Ithaca asked me. She said, "Are you getting some good writing done this summer?" And I said, "No, my computer's broken, so I haven't really been writing." And she looked at me and she said, "You ever think about just pulling out some staff paper and a pencil?" And I was, for me, that was sort of a, yeah, you're right. Like, I think you do that. But I noticed, I got some of my music here. Ugh. Let's see. That's not a good example. I want to find something that actually got performed. Oh. So this piece eventually did get performed. This is my first draft. This is from a piece I wrote 2 years ago for the Olympia Symphony. But, you know, I just sat down. I literally sat down and wrote this kind of in my head, kind of in the style of like a texture graph where I'm just kind of creating things.
Yeah.
And then I would go over to the piano and check my harmonies and whatnot. But this was a lot slower practice, but it made me thinking a lot about the piece. And this particular thing in this notebook, actually, the funny thing about this is, speaking of form and everything, is this, which was originally my idea for the beginning of the piece of music, was actually what I ended up using as like the center of the composition. And I'd be happy to send you a link to that as well. So,
well, maybe a good question with no good answers is, for all of these kids who, for the most part, just play, you know, one note instruments where it's just, you know, there's no harmony involved. Well, we can play, you know, chords if we're, you know, advanced taking private lessons. But how does somebody who doesn't conceive harmony while playing their own part consider composing harmonies for a melody that they've written, especially if they're not an accomplished pianist?
Well, that's a hard question for me to answer because I started on piano actually, so so I had a strong base with doing two voices. In fact, actually, that's a hard thing for me to this day, is playing. Maybe that's why I'm maybe drawn more to the viola than the violin, because the viola is the inner voice. But on the violin, I kind of want to hear the additional harmonies, like while I'm playing, or you know, that kind of thing. Man, that's a good question. I was gonna say, again, trial and error. Like if you can imagine, hey, like this is my part, you know, this is how my part goes. I'd love to have another part that moves against it. Have you ever listened to the Beatles anthologies before?
Yeah.
One of my favorite moments in I think it's like the third Beatles anthology, and I don't remember which disc it is on because it was released on CD, but it's Paul McCartney. It's I think personally, if you're really familiar with the Beatles, it's really fascinating to listen to them because it's them hanging out in the studio, like writing their music essentially. And Paul McCartney's working on "She Came In Through the Bathroom Window," I think, and he's like, he gets to, didn't anybody tell her? Didn't anybody see? Sunday's on the phone till Monday. Tuesday's on the phone with me. And so they get through that part, and like that's obviously as far as they had written. And Paul McCartney, you can hear him like turn to like John, and he's like, and then right there for the counterpart, I want it to be do 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 do. Like he has this like whole counterpart thing that never ended up in the piece, but it's like, man, like that's really cool. Like it's like, and you can tell he had thought of it. Maybe he hadn't sung it before, but it's this really cool, like it almost sounds like a Bach like cello suite, like bass line involved in there. I don't think it ended up in the final one, because I think if I remember correctly, that song is just very homophonic. Jung, 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 nah, do 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 do. Like he has this really cool walking bass line. Anyway, I don't know if you remember that, but like that for me, something that's the way you can think about it. I mean, I think a texture graph too. If you were to write out your one voice part and then figure out what the second voice is, and kind of draw it in the line underneath, like as you write it out. Sometimes I'll do that too. If I know I'm writing for more than one instrument, I'll leave spaces. Like so like this is stuff I didn't end up using, but here's like the upper voices, and then I have space in here so I could fill in what I'm gonna do. So I could easily go, okay, is this gonna be rhythmically the same, or is this going to be different? Man, I really wish I could find. There's one I wrote a few years ago, and I think the same kind of thing. I wrote a piece for 6 violas, and I literally wrote out like 90% of it by hand, and you can see a lot of like my shorthand for things, and it's also very interesting because I was kind of impressed with, yeah. So maybe I could take this might be interesting. I could scan this and send it along to you guys. So this is a piece that I wrote, and I wrote it entirely. I wrote it entirely by hand, like at least 90% of it. So this is the first page of music, and it was for 6 violas, and I didn't want to have to write out 6 different voices, so I actually wrote out like in piano score. So this is, you know, in like I could sit down at a piano and play this as a piano piece, and then you can see like this is me in the editing process. But I was like, okay, now we have to have a quick, you know, change in tempo. And I wrote this out, and I went back and couldn't figure out what I was going to do next. So I ended up crossing it out. Don't be afraid to use your eraser when you're composing. I've had many composition, I don't want to say teachers, but many master classes or what do you call them? Studio classes with composition teachers.
Yeah.
And they'll talk about, well, what part's more important, this part or this part. And you know, I could scan this for you guys and kind of show you what I did, but I have a kind of a shorthand like you see over here where I have the same, whoopsie, can you see that all right with the color?
Yeah.
I have the same chord, but I just wrote out, okay, instead of writing out the same chord over and over again, because it's
kind of like the way the guitar tab is written sometimes for musicals.
Right, basically. And I mean, like, it makes sense to me, and I don't expect it to make sense to somebody else. And I also do like to change up the meter a lot in my music, so there's parts where I just kind of stop keeping track of where the meter was, and like, okay, this makes sense, you know, and whatnot. You know, I got little notes like, hey, you know, before this area, you know, bring back something from the beginning, you know. And again, this is all after this process of me sitting down and figuring out like, how's this going to work out. But you can kind of see how these texture things work out. Like this page is full of it where I just have rhythm, and it's just the same note over and over again, but I just kind of wrote it out in shorthand.
Yep.
You know? But that might be interesting for you guys to look through. And then you can, at the end of the piece, I actually had this idea to write this, out, I had this idea to write out like this fugue. I think it's actually interesting because so this must be where I ended with my ideas, and I ran over to Sibelius and I started writing it out, and then in that process kind of orchestrating it. But it's funny because then the next piece, this was like a next piece that I wrote, which was for viola and trombone, which I thought was hilarious. So I had one of my two of my friends, they're married, Lindsay and what's the husband's name? So we'll just say Lindsay and husband. The husband plays trombone with the Boise Philharmonic. He's like principal trombone player, and Lindsay plays assistant principal viola. And so they had asked, and I made friends with them at a festival, and they said they wanted an original piece for trombone and viola. And that just intrigues me in general because you have one of the softest instruments in the orchestra paired with like the loudest instrument in the orchestra. So I wrote them a piece. Mike, that's his name, Michael. So Mike and Lindsay. So yeah.
As we're wrapping it up here, I kind of got 2 questions to frame things for kids interested in composition, or just people in general interested in composition. First is, if I want to go through some, like a list of music listening with increasing complexity and orchestration, where might I start, and what's maybe a good piece to listen to as orchestration gets more complex.
So like a beginning and an end.
Well, like a piece for each like level of complexity in orchestration.
Man, this is a hard one. Okay, let me think. So I think if you were to start off just to have everything in one place for a two voice piece is the Handel Halvorsen
The Pascal.
Pascal. Yeah. That, I mean, there's a lot of, and there's besides that, there's a lot of stuff going on in that piece where every 8 measures it changes texture. Like that's a good one actually. If you sat down and listened to that and filled out a graph sheet to that piece, that would be an awesome one to just to kind of hear where everything's coming from and where all these
and as a composer, that the Passacaglia form, you really don't have to come up with that much musical material to put a really nice finished piece of music together, because it's more or less the same 12, 16 bars in a theme and variations, for lack of a better term. I mean, it is a Passacaglia, but for people who don't know what that is, it's like a theme and variations.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know. I've never written a chaconne or a Passacaglia, and not that I don't think I will or anything like that, but there's something about that for me personally where I think it might seem a little bit easier than, or it might seem a little easier than what it actually is, because to come up like with a good flow of how everything fits together. And I think the Handel Halvorsen Passacaglia works out pretty well in that it starts off big and long, and then it gets kind of softer and faster. And then I mean, like, again, like if you were to sit down and do a graph, textural graph to that, you're gonna be in like Flynn, because you're gonna see how he's doing everything. And I mean, if you're able to do at least like 1% of what they're doing in that piece, compositionally, that'd be amazing. So yeah, I mean, like I would say for like that could be level 1. And again, I'm not saying that you should be able to write that at level 1. I'm just saying that has
that
enough.
Would be pretty impressive.
Has enough like information. And there's other pieces I could mention well before that and after that and everything, but that one to me kind of stands out as one. And I could go through like level for level, but I think for a student at like in a high school, like I think like the top one, and there's other ones that are much more complex and whatnot, but the top one I'd have to say is The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky. Because there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff going on in there. Actually, funny enough, if you want to hear kind of an interesting version of that, I think it was just released because
there's a string orchestra version now, isn't there?
Oh, there's a string orchestra version, but there's one that this is more of kind of a humorous thing. You'd probably enjoy it more than the students, but somebody, I think it's all digital. I don't think it's live, but somebody did it with all harpsichords. So it just sounds like it just gets the dissonance is like very blaring.
Oh no.
So and there's no dynamic change. There's no articulation change. Like it's just this kind of, I mean, like in a way that tells you why you need to have like different colors and different textures going on in your orchestrations. So I'd say that'd be a good endpoint. And I mean, like I have to say, with The Rite of Spring, I have all my scores downstairs, or else I'd pull it out. But I have to say that I don't know, maybe like once every year, I'll pull out my score of The Rite of Spring, and I'll pull out a few different recordings, and I'll always find like 10 new things that I never noticed before in that piece when I go through it. And I've had composition teachers, tell me to go through it and like map out the orchestrations. But I mean, it's one of those pieces that there's a lot of stuff going on in it, and it's something worth revisiting many times in your lifetime. I've never performed it, unfortunately. I'd love to perform it, but that's that. But I'm trying to think about what would be like in between those two, the Handel Halvorsen. And again, I just kind of came up with that at the top of my head. The Igor Stravinsky, for a high schooler, they were able to get their hands on the score and get their hands on a few recordings Like that would be ideal. Um, I mean, I would say personally, everything in between the Handel Halvorsen as a starter piece and the Stravinsky Rite of Spring. If you were to, I remember one of my composition teachers, um, he was showing off Bach cantatas one time in like a theory class or something like that. And I was like, man, like these things are really good.
They are juicier than you would think. There's a lot going on.
There's a lot going on. And I remember being like, man, like, and I know there's hundreds of them. So I'm like, man, like, where should I start? And I asked him, I came up to him and I said, man, like, I read about Bach cantatas, but I never actually sat down and listened to them. Like, which one should I start with? And he was like, just any of them. They're all good. They're every single one of them are good. And so I'd say like in between Handel Halvorsen and Rite of Spring, if you were to, I'm not saying listen to all of the Bach cantatas. I don't think I've listened to all the Bach cantatas. I don't think the world has listened to all the Bach cantatas because it seems like every few years they'll discover another one or something.
Find a couple more, yeah.
Yeah. But they'll, if you're like to process music that way, that is really eye-opening. And it goes between like full symphonic writing to like an aria. It's just voice and keyboard and like chorale. I mean, like there's everything in there that you would need. Back to Samuel Adler and Nadia Boulanger. I've had the opportunity in my lifetime as well to meet Samuel Adler twice in my lifetime. And I remember one time when I met him, he was talking about how like once a week, the composition studio, Nadia Boulanger's composition studio, would get together and they would sight read a Bach cantata. And they did that every once a week, like in a different Bach cantata. So, for I don't know however many years he studied with her, but he went through a different Bach cantata every week.
Well, and I think Nadia Boulanger, that was one of her primary conducting tools, was that when you showed up to your lesson, no matter what instrument you played, you were expected to play a Bach chorale or something like that. And part of the story with Piazzolla that I remember was she asked him to play some Bach chorales, and maybe it wasn't Piazzolla, but said, well, I don't play the organ. She said, well, that's fine. Come back next week and play one of the Bach chorales for me.
Yeah, no, if you can, you might want to load up. There's some interesting videos of her teaching. There's one, I think it might be like the first hit on YouTube of she has like the youngest kid in her studio, and the youngest kid is like 8 years old or something ridiculous like that. And he's like this virtuoso pianist, and they got all these other composers hanging around the piano, and she's basically, everything is live. They're not like playing recordings and listening to recordings and whatnot, but she's having them read down I want to say like a Schubert leader or something like that, and I think or a piece, a chamber piece by Schubert, and she just tells him like play the melody line, and so he starts playing it, and she in the middle of or at the end of the phrase, she just takes his hand and rips it off the piano, and they have like this whole like 5-minute discussion about like this 8 measures of music and like what's going on, because and it's interesting because what she's getting at, she's doing this like Socratic seminar. What she's getting at in that process is without any harmonies or without any other thing happening except for this one voice being played, like the right hand of the piano being played, you can tell that the phrase ends with a half cadence, and that there's no other indication except for the fact that you're listening to the line, and as a musician you can tell that the harmonies would have it be a half cadence. So anyway, I mean, like in other words, for the students, that it does not end on a chord like the tonic. It ends essentially on the dominant chord. So the phrase ends on a note that's.
Well, that makes me think if I'm attempting to be a composer and I have no keyboard experience whatsoever, is it pretty much going to continue to be a barrier for me if I don't learn how to at least manipulate a piano?
No, I mean, that in this day and age you have, the computer to do that for you. There's some famous composers that didn't play piano.
Mhm.
Number one, the one that everyone likes to talk about is Berlioz. Berlioz didn't know how
Yeah,
to play piano, and Berlioz wrote some of the best orchestrations ever. Like
yeah,
the symphony,
absolutely.
people say things like the symphony was his keyboard. And same thing with Wagner. Wagner didn't play piano,
Hmm.
and um, he like the tradition, for people leading up to Wagner was you had to learn how to play keyboard. So if you can play on keyboard, you can orchestrate. And
Yeah,
Wagner wasn't known for being a keyboard player. I don't know if he played at all, but I don't think he wrote any pieces that include piano. In other words, I think most of his music that I've seen, I mean, that I've seen transcribed. Actually, if you ever want to listen to something kind of ear opening, if you're familiar with Wagner's, check out piano transcriptions of his music, because piano transcriptions are like,
oh yeah.
this doesn't sound like Wagner. This sounds like Debussy. Like all of a sudden. Um, anyway,
I was just listening to a transcription of the Parsifal Prelude,
yeah.
and it's just so bizarre on piano. I think it would work even better on organ, but that's a totally different topic.
Well, there's a Wagner piece I want to orchestrate for like freshman orchestra. I want
Mhm.
to orchestrate the entrance of the gods into Valhalla. Ba,
Yes.
ba, 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 ba.
Hmm.
Anyway, but yeah, so I would say I would look at the lack of piano. If you've gotten this far in orchestra with no piano background, I would
Uh-huh.
look at it as maybe a
Yep.
strength, because you're going to go through things with a much different lens
Yeah.
than a
And-
keyboard player. That's something actually I have to remind myself when I'm orchestrating, because
Yeah.
I'll notice that I'll be putting everything kind of in, it makes sense
In
for a
piano
keyboard
mode.
player, and I
Yeah.
realize, well, wait a minute, the bassoon can go much lower, and the violin can go much higher, So
That was definitely a prejudice that I dealt with as a non. I mean, I can use a piano functionally, and I took organ lessons in undergrad. But
mhm,
as a composer and as a conductor, that is something that kind of brings shame on you as somebody who isn't a fantastic pianist. But it always seemed to me as just that, as a prejudice, that it's not. It can definitely be helpful to have piano skill if you would like to, read through a score or do an on the spot transcription in a conducting masterclass. But there's so many people that it didn't prevent from becoming, masterful as a conductor or a composer.
mhm. Yeah, I think that, again, it's not a hindrance. If especially if you've gotten to this level, if you've gotten to the secondary level on your instrument,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, again, back to the Beatles. The Beatles, I think none of them knew how to read music. They're just really musically inclined.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's all these people that I'm aware of nowadays, because they have access to all the software,
Yeah.
like Reason and whatnot, and they're I would consider them to be much more successful than I am, producing like commercial music and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But they have even less knowledge of composition, or less knowledge of
Mm-hmm.
music than you, as a student, like I'm talking to your students, have. And they're just kind of going with, well, this is a pleasing sound, and this sounds good, and this sounds good. And I mean, um trial and error, like that's going to be your best
Yeah.
your
Well,
best learner. To bring up a Star Wars quote, there's that line from Yoda,
do or do not. There is no try.
that do or do not. That's my favorite. I say that like almost every day. But actually the one from Last Jedi, I
Oh,
I
yeah.
really enjoy. The line is, failure, teacher, the best teacher, the failure is the best teacher.
The
Or,
best teacher failure is.
yeah, the best teacher, failure is. There we go. I had to translate it. Thank you.
Well, I think that pretty much puts a bow on our conversation. Uh, I've got no problems with having a 2-hour podcast. If Joe Rogan go 3 or 4, we can do 2, I think. Uh,
Well, are you, so you're doing this in podcast format, or is this the end of it, or
well, pretty much. I'll stop record here in a second, and these go straight up to YouTube. And then any documents you want to share with me, go to my students on our Google Classroom.
I was gonna say you could do a fade out of some of my music or whatever. I'll send you a few
yeah,
things.
I'd be happy to do that.
I'll scan this. I'll scan this thing. I was gonna say you can have it be. Let's put a nice little bow on our conversang. You can fade into one of my.
Yes, I'd love to. I'm learning how to use iMovie through this whole process, so I think I can manage.
But the other podcasts, I'd love to. You have them posted publicly, or they?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to. I saw.
Yeah, I'll send you that link as soon as we wrap this up.
Cool. Excellent. Well, good. I might send you them off to my students.
Yeah, no problem. That's what they're for.
All right then. Well, good to see you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Austin. Be well.
You are.